The Elliot Leigh Property Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Elliot Leigh official podcast. Elliot Leigh, of course, have been at the forefront of property management and private sector leasing for over 20 years. There's nothing these guys don't know about the world of landlords and tenants. This episode is one of a series of programs looking at a variety of different themes from this ever-evolving industry. And to talk us through the issues, one of the founders of Elliot Leigh, Leigh Young, and also we're joined by Paul Shamplina, Managing Director of Landlord Action. Welcome to you both. Leigh, firstly, we know a lot about Paul because he does tend to appear kind of everywhere these days. But Leigh, just give us a little bit of background to your company and what you guys specialise in.
Absolutely. Yes, Paul does appear everywhere. I can concur. So we've been going over 20 years as Elliot Leigh. Myself and Elliot have been in property, and our families indeed, probably approaching 30 odd years. And we've always dealt with local authorities, and it became apparent to us just over 20 years ago that there's more that could be done for social housing, and there was a reticence with landlords to sort of let to social housing and that kind of thing, and we thought there must be a better way of doing this. So we came up with a concept where we could perhaps offer landlords long-term leasing, guaranteed rents where their voids were covered and they would get their rent every month, irrespective of what was going on within the property. And also we could provide some sort of long-term secure housing for people in need with local authorities, and hence the guaranteed rent scheme was born. 20 years on, unfortunately, there is still a big housing need, perhaps bigger, and we're still going very strong and bigger than ever.
And bigger than ever, and working in an industry that is becoming more complex than ever, because I mentioned the ever-evolving world of this area. I mean, that sort of understates it, really, doesn't it? You know, the amount of rules and regulations that are coming in the rental sector, the whole landscape is absolutely huge.
Absolutely. I mean, since we've been doing this in 20 years, there's been a raft of legislation and a lot of things that have been put onto landlords. Some good, some quite draconian, we feel, but it is becoming harder for landlords to sort of manage their properties and look after the compliance and everything that's changed, the landscape has changed in this last 20 years. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And Paul, we've talked a lot over the years about the ever-changing world. I think, a government comes in, they have an idea, then something gets dropped, and then there's an amendment, then it goes kicked into the long grass. Then another government come in, they adopt some of it, lose other bits, bring in new ideas. I mean, to say that it's a merry-go-round, hardly touches the sides.
Ian, having 13 housing ministers in 15 years doesn't help. We don't have any continuity. And we've spoke many a time on the radio live to your listeners. Being a landlord now is the most difficult thing ever. It is a profession. There is an art to property management.
Yeah.
We have a terrible social housing crisis, a temporary accommodation crisis that has been crumbling. Thus, why Elliot Leigh have been so important. I think you've paid something like £400 million out in 20 years or something for your landlords.
£400 million.
Yeah.
We've looked after about 50,000 tenants,
wow.
I think, in that time as well.
Which is a lot of tenants. But I think now, if we look at the landscape, which we're going to talk about with regard to the Renters' Rights Bill, it's looking like, I'm hearing, it's going to be coming in the summer. And of course, like I said, with the raft of legislation, the reason it was brought in, it was going to be the Renters' Reform Bill. The reason it's been brought in is about more secure tenure for tenants, safer property, decent home standards. It's effectively a levelling up. This is why this legislation has been brought in, and it is going in, but there's still a lot of work to be done. It's going to be a committee stage. It's going to be obviously ping-ponging between House of Commons and House of Lords. But the reality is, in the world of landlording, landlords are apprehensive, they're scared, and there's a lack of confidence. And, the worry is, and I called this 5 years ago, if you don't get this legislation right, and if landlords don't get confidence, the end result is landlords end up selling. The alternative is, instead of self-management or using a letting agent, is possibly, having 3 and 5 year leases with companies such like Elliot Leigh, because of course a lot of this legislation is irrelevant. It doesn't kick in because of course it's not an assured short-hold tenancy. It's not going to be a periodic tenancy. They have leases and their occupants in the property have licenses. So it's exempt effectively.
What's interesting, Lee, just on the back of that, is that this is an area, private sector, landlords, tenants, etc., that is actually and consistently helped the government with the housing crisis, because it is still a crisis. But often there is a sense from landlords that they are treated almost the very opposite to that.
I think, as Paul said, there's really been no joint coherent approach to housing, I think, in this country for the past, since we've been doing it in the past 20 years. And the problem is we're not building enough housing. And I think the private rented sector has become the sort of sticking plaster for that crisis. There is a lot of legislation out there already. Property licenses have come in, and there's a lot coming in, some good, some quite draconian, as we say. And a lot of landlords are frightened. When you think, I think 80% of landlords out there are sort of either accidental landlords or perhaps own 1 to 3 properties. It's becoming a real professional job now to be a landlord. As Paul alluded to, touching to the Renters' Rights Bill that I think we all know it is coming in now. We don't know. I think it's pretty much, we don't know what incarnation it will be, but certainly the two main standout things that are coming in is the abolition of the Section 21 and periodic tenancies. And that's really quite frightening for landlords, because they'll have to rely on Section 8s, perhaps with tenants. And as we know, and as Paul will tell you, courts are absolutely backed up. It can take a year with a bailiff to evict. And we hope to be the answer to that. So rather than landlords exiting, we're speaking to a lot of landlords that are really considering exiting the market, which is no good for anyone. So there's going to be an even more shortage of property. We're hoping to bring them over to us and show them what we do, and that there is an alternative.
And what does that alternative look like?
Well, it looks like a guaranteed rent leasing scheme where we would take the property for 3 years, so 3 to 5 years. The landlord will get their guaranteed rent on every month, irrespective of what's going on. There's no worries about eviction, because we deal with that. We deal with the maintenance. We do all inspections. We just take care of everything. So really, it takes all that stress away from the landlord.
And I think that's because, we help you guys if we do need to issue possession proceedings, don't we?
Absolutely.
If landlords do want to sell, which does happen. The reality is there's no rent arrears, which is a landlord's biggest fear. And of course, we talk about void periods. A void period is when a property is empty and a landlord loses money. And of course, there's no letting costs. So when you use a letting agent, what happens is you have to pay a let fee.
The rent we quote is the rent you get, essentially.
And the occupants in there, they are people on temporary accommodation from the council. How many councils do you act with?
We're working currently with anything up to 28 boroughs, certainly in London and sort of southeast. Yeah, so we spread quite widely now in the southeast. Certainly Essex and Kent and London, practically every London borough.
And it's interesting, Paul, isn't it, that we've talked about this stereotype of landlords, which there is a very real sense, and maybe this government will prove differently, but there's a very real sense that perhaps this new administration kind of fall into believing that stereotype more than anyone else.
Yeah, look, I've been campaigning for landlords. I've been active in landlords for 34 years, and I've been running Landlord Action for 25 years now, and I do lots of campaigning. Unfortunately, the word landlord is deemed as a dirty word now, And maybe it should be housing provider, which is what Elliot Leigh are.
Yeah.
The tenants are customers. But of course, our social housing, we've got, 70 million people now living in this country. Our infrastructure has been broken for some time. Good, affordable, solid housing is at a shortage. And it's, Labour have got the right intention. They said they want to build 1.5 million properties in 5 years, which is a pipe dream. But it's good that they have that ambition. And of course, they've got to release all the planning laws. That needs to open up. But the reality is, it's supply and demand. I think, landlords, and I say this when, I'm doing a talk on Friday in Birmingham to about 200 landlords. I say to them, landlord, you need to put a price on your time. And I think historically, Ian, landlords haven't done that. They've always tried to cut a bit of corners, tried to do stuff themselves. Trying to be a landlord, you're a jack of all trades. You're a mediator, you're a social worker, you're a credit controller, because it is a people business. And I think now landlords, and some landlords have done very well because they've had a lot of equity they've made in their properties and stuff, and rents have gone up. But I think they do need to look in the mirror and think, what, do I really want to be taking a call from the tenant at 4 a.m. that they've lost their keys because they're drunk, or the boiler's broken down? And I think that's where I try and educate landlords, even if they've got 1 or 2 properties.
No, absolutely. I would concur with Paul there that the pressures on landlords have increased. And actually, the penalties out there for landlords, if they get it wrong, are really great now because, as you know, if you don't get paid your rent, then you're in all sorts of trouble.
True.
You could be fined by the council. There's property licensing. If you don't get that right, you could be fined. But also what we're seeing is now there's dilapidation claims coming in. That tenants are launching with lawyers that are out there sort of hunting down tenants to insight, we're seeing a lot of these dilapidation claims, which we deal with on behalf of landlords.
I think what's going to be a big problem in the future for landlords, and I say this in my public speaking, is rent repayment orders. So if a landlord rents, I mean, obviously, Elliot Leigh got 1,700 properties they manage for landlords all over, London. If a property is not licensed, a lot of landlords don't license properties, and there's naivety or there's criminality or whatever it may be. If they don't license the property and it's not fully licensed in that area, and normally a borough, then what can happen is the tenant can reclaim all their rent back up to 2 years. That's going to come in the legislation. So can you imagine? And you know what? Dumb insolence and naivety is not a defence.
But how would just as maybe this is a naive question, Paul, I'm trying to think of the logic behind that. Just because somebody has, it's not good if they haven't got the right license in place, agreed. But how does that then equate to the tenant being due their money back?
Well, you know what? It's like there's a lot of ambulance chasing lawyers that are going to act for tenants. Quite rightly, if tenants are paying 35% of their wages towards rent, they deserve a decent property. They deserve a decent service. And the government have turned around and said, you know what, you landlords, because not just under the Renters' Rights Bill, which are the headline grabbers of periodic tenancies and the abolishment of Section 21 and rent increases once a year, is also decent home standard, is a landlord register. So that's going to happen. There's a landlord register in Scotland and Wales. There's also going to be landlord redress. So, if a tenant complains about a landlord, they've got somewhere to go to.
Yeah.
Because obviously, your rent or your mortgage payment is your biggest payment that comes out your pay packet every month, isn't it? So it's about, I do actually think, and I'm putting on a few educational days myself with, as you know, with Tracy and Steve from the Landlord Investment Show. I'm doing those in London. I really do think that landlords need some sort of mandatory training. They do that in Wales, called Rent Smart Wales, because if you're managing a property, you need to know what you're doing. It's got to be taken serious. And I think if you bring that in, it is the real first step of this industry actually being recognised as being a profession. And that's the problem. It's not deemed as a profession.
And I always make this point when we're talking about sort of stereotypes and the like and how things used to be, Leigh. I mean, we were back in the day, you'd meet a mate in the pub who knew somebody who was renting out a house and he'd introduce you, you'd give him a couple of £100 and you moved in. That was it. And of course, we know that some iffy landlords have been out there over the years. That's just the way it is. But most landlords, this is their business. I mean, they don't want to be bad landlords. They're not bad landlords. They look after the place. They want good tenants.
And yeah, exactly as you say, compliance is everything. And, back in the day, it was very easy. But ourselves, having worked with local authorities for over 20 years, we've kind of worked to those decent home standards for all that time anyway. So when we take on a new landlord, we look at the property, we talk them through what's needed, what needs to be to get it up to compliance, whether it needs a property license.
How many people do you have in your maintenance team? You've got a lot of people.
We've got about 25 people out on the road, vans everywhere.
Wow.
So we pretty much have been taking properties on at the decent home standard for the last 20 years anyway. Very often we knock back properties that we don't think is right anyway. If we don't feel we like the landlord or we like
you've got your reputation.
It's reputational, and at the end of the day, we wouldn't want to put a tenant.
And the council want a certain standard.
We wouldn't want to put a tenant in anywhere we wouldn't want to live ourselves, I guess.
Yeah. Absolutely. Which kind of brings us to the rather obvious conclusion that, governments and individuals who are looking to rent somewhere and landlords need to professionalise what's happening here. So companies like Elliot Leigh do exactly that. So if there are questions and you're not sure, then that's why trying to go it alone can be a bit of a tricky path.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would say is certainly if you're talking about London, there's so many different standards with different boroughs and different requirements and different property licensing schemes.
That's where landlords trip up.
And that's where landlords trip up. There might be schemes in some boroughs that are not in other boroughs. And where we have that joint up approach and we look at all the boroughs, we know sort of all the requirements and what's needed wherever you are.
The government do need companies like Elliot Leigh, don't they? I mean, it would be stupid to think otherwise.
Well, we think so, and we've proven ourselves over the last 20 years with the relationships that we've built with the London boroughs especially, and they come to us first for whenever there's a crisis or whenever there's a need.
I think the important thing, one thing we haven't really addressed is let's think about people that are in temporary accommodation, Ian. the reasons why they're in temporary accommodation. They could have been evicted. There could be domestic abuse. I mean, there's a whole raft of information, details as to why they end up in temporary accommodation. The good thing is, rather than a family being cooped up in a hotel room, which you do see, and which is very common and is a massive problem, and we see it all in the news, don't we?
We do.
Don't we, Leigh?
Yeah.
Is that you are giving them an actual property. And just one thing I was going to ask you, Leigh, which I don't know about, you've got 1,700 properties or whatever with families and all over the London for different boroughs and whatever. How long do these people stay before? I mean, because obviously they want to be rehoused by a housing association or by council, but there's no council properties, is there?
They're obviously, this is the big thing. There is a shortage of council stock. On average, we could have anyone up to 5 years or 6 years in a property. They could move on quicker, but some people can be there depending on their needs and their requirements could be there for years. We sort of tend to get to know them and we've looked after them for
I think one thing that I picked up from Elliot Leigh, Ian, is they also have a care business, which is quite relevant. It shows that you need to know how to care about the occupant and have some sort of understanding and empathy rather than just being statistically a number.
As Paul said, about 5-6 years ago, one of the local authorities came to us and said, look, you do a very good job with housing and property. Have you ever thought of doing care? And it's not something we thought of, but we looked into it and we sort of really went into it and set it up and got the right people in. And we now got something called Elliot Leigh TLC, which is Transforming Leaving Care. We're now looking after about 150 young people, 16 to 24 in various settings. And we have a whole raft of key workers that go out and do outreach, and we have outcomes and we do some great work there. So again, it gives us that sort of social conscious. And then hopefully this year as well, we're looking to open our foundation, the Elliot Leigh Foundation, where we thought, well, over 20 years, we've got to know the needs and wants of people, and we want to give a bit back. So we're going to sort of get welfare officers in, do, as we do with the TLC, and go out and do some outreach with people, and also sort of engage with local charities and sort of organisations and see what we can do to help.
What's interesting, and one of the conversations I have with quite a lot of landlords and infuriates many, is that with all the sort of rules, regulations and big spotlight on landlords and the like, some of the biggest problems in inadequate housing actually happen in the council sector, right? Who are not always subject to the same rules and laws, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. I've done loads of media. I did a media programme with Dan Hewitt on ITV News exposing social housing, I think for Croydon Council, where there was a mushroom growing on the wall and terrible conditions the family were in. And, the young child was suffering, of course, with asthma. And, of course, we had Awab's Law, which is coming in, the poor little boy that died in Rochdale, down to mould in 2022. Nothing like that should ever happen. The reality is, I'll nail my colours to the mast, is that I think that the social housing sector is actually worse than the private rental sector. They get an easier rap than the private rental sector. And I think it's an issue. I think that, I can tell you now on the stat, the last year, complaints have gone up with regard to social housing 330%. There was 22,000 adjudications or complaints made to the housing ombudsman in social housing, which I can tell you is far worse than the private rental sector, because, of course, one of the organisations that I help run and a part of our group is the Property Redress Scheme, which is a redress scheme for letting agents and agents where landlords and tenants make complaints. That's now going to come in for landlords. And I think the most complaints that they make about private rental sector landlords will naturally be repairs, won't it, Leigh?
Yes, absolutely. Repairs is a big thing. And if not sort of addressed quickly, they can fester and get worse for the tenants and the landlords.
And they make relationships between parties
this is
worse.
Probably the biggest cause of relationship breakdown. So, that's why we have a complete in-house maintenance team. We do it all ourselves. We've got gas engineers, electrical qualified guys, and we sort of have a whole raft of markers where we need to attend properties in what space of time, depending on the repair.
Yeah, which should be a real comfort to landlords, knowing that is part of the backup that is there. So just then, in conclusion, Leigh, just give us an overview. Then we've touched on all of these issues, but sum it up for us in terms of why landlords or local authorities, whoever it happens to be, really should be looking at a company like Elliot Leigh to take care of this and not be going it alone and trying it yourself?
Well, I mean, as we've been saying, we've been doing this for 20 years. We know what we're doing. We've changed, we've moved along with legislation, how compliance has come along. We're up to date with it all. If you're a nervous landlord and worried, or you're thinking of selling, then there is an alternative. We are that alternative. We do fall outside a lot of what's coming in on the renters' rights bills. It won't affect what you do with us because we guarantee all that. Local authorities already deal with us, so they know the kind of service we give.
And actually, on that point, they're very stringent who they work with, aren't they?
They are. We have to follow very stringent tests and tenders and such like. They don't just work with anyone. And yeah, I would say if you're a landlord, get in touch. There is an alternative if you're worried.
Can I just ask you one question just on that point, actually, because I never really understand it, is the rates. How much rates do you generally pay landlords to private rentals or local housing allowance, LHA?
So we pay, it's worked on a matrix of local housing allowance and private rent, but generally our rates are pretty much market rent.
Really?
Yep.
So there's no letting fees?
No letting fees, and we're pretty much there with market rates in your area. Within London, it makes sense.
And Paul, just a final point on the overarching state of the industry, where it's likely to go. The landlord and tenant world, as we said at the beginning, has been subject to all manner of different rules, regulations, speculation, stereotyping, and the list goes on. But it does survive. I mean, it always survives. It always comes through. How do you see this whole industry in a year's time?
I think that they can't bring everything in one bang. I think that there's going to be a transitional period. My biggest worry, which I've said 5 years ago when I saw the white paper, is the courts, because obviously we do 4,000 instructions a year at Landlord Action. We see it. We see landlords exiting. So that's been my big worry, because of course if a landlord exits or they sell the property, the loser in that property is actually going to be the tenant, because obviously they've got to find somewhere else, and there's a real shortage of properties maybe in that local area, and they've got to pay a lot more rent, and obviously disposable income. The cost of living crisis is going to go up. Let's be honest. 2025 economically doesn't look too bright from what analysts are saying, out there. So I think that my advice to landlords, and I say this all the time, if you don't need to sell, don't sell. Being a landlord 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago is completely different to what it is now. These changes in the Renters' Rights Bill, the biggest changes in 30 years. Most of it is all really, really workable. Understand and educate yourself. This is a business. If you don't have time to educate yourself, then use an organisation like Elliot Leigh, or if you decide you want to go traditional letting, then use an accredited letting agent. Property management is difficult, and time consuming, and it's a relationship business. But I think the annoying thing that I get a bit cheesed off with is there's loads of great landlords out there that really care about their tenants, which doesn't make the news channels because, unfortunately, nightmare tenants, slum landlords, dare I say it, does make TV.
Yeah, great tenants, great landlords doesn't so much, does it? Just be like almost a Mills and Boon romance almost in that respect. And who wants to see that?
I feel like that after this podcast. Ian.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah, well, it has that effect. Final word, Leigh, then, in terms of, look, it's an industry there's always going to be bumps in the road. Every industry knows that. Good companies like your own circumnavigate, get through it. Where do you see the industry in a year's time? It's clearly going to survive. It'll look a little different in some respects, but what are your speculations on 12 months from now?
I think there's still going to be landlords, there's still going to be tenants, there's still going to be a need. Yes, it's an interesting year that's coming up for landlords, and we'll see how it pans out, but there's always going to be a need for housing. There's always going to be a need for good landlords. So I would say if you don't, please don't exit the market if you don't have to, because it will come back. There is a future. Keep yourself up to date with legislation, compliance, because you can trip up with what's coming in.
Words of wisdom there to finish with. Thank you, guys. Leigh, we will speak soon. Paul, we will speak soon.
Pleasure.
This has been the Elliot Leigh official podcast. Stand by for episode 2 coming soon.